Hello and welcome to the Analyst dated 5th October 2023 by Vajiram and Ravi, wherein we'll be looking into important current affairs article from both the Hindu as well as Indian Express. And the handout of this very discussion is available in the description below. Let's have a look over the table of content. So firstly, we are going to look into the issues with regard to centrally sponsored schemes. And we'll also try to understand that how we can improve the implementation and the formulation of centrally sponsored schemes. Then we'll be looking into the changing rainfall patterns in India. We'll try to understand that what are the impacts and consequences of changing rainfall patterns in India and what needs to be done in that regard. Then we'll be looking into the issues with regard to the functioning of government hospitals. What are the causes of that? And we'll also be looking into this aspect that what needs to be done in order to improve the functioning of the government hospitals in India. Then we'll be looking into Nobel Prize for Chemistry, which has been given for the innovation of quantum dots. Then we'll be looking into the glacial lake outburst. We'll try to understand that what is this glacial lake outburst. Let's look into the first topic that pertains to centrally sponsored schemes, and this topic pertains to this aspect of my GS paper 2 syllabus. Let's try and understand the context. So the context is central government has flagged certain misappropriation of funds with regard to these two centrally sponsored schemes in the state of West Bengal. So in that regard, it sent a monitoring team in the state of West Bengal to look into the misappropriation of funds when it comes to these two centrally sponsored schemes in the state of West Bengal. And based on the recommendation of that very team, the state of West Bengal was supposed to give an action taken report. But the state of West Bengal did not provide the action taken report within the stipulated time frame. So in this background, the central government withheld the funds under these two schemes, that is MG Narega and Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Gramin. And in this background, Trinamool Congress is holding protest in Delhi. Now, the first thing that we need to understand with regard to this article is what are centrally sponsored schemes. So, such schemes are partially funded by both the center as well as states in a predetermined ratio. So, that ratio could be 60-40 or 90-10. Okay. And these schemes basically relates to the subjects which are there in the state list, and the implementation of these schemes rest with the state governments and with the union territory administration. Okay. Now, when it comes to the centrally sponsored schemes, they are classified under three heads. One is the core scheme, under which the center and the state, they come together and they perform as a team, and these schemes basically relates to developmental agenda like Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. Then we have core of core schemes, which basically intends to realize the idea of social protection and social inclusion. So example are MG Narega. Then we have optional scheme. So now when it comes to optional schemes, it is up to the state that whether they want to implement this particular scheme or not. So freedom has been given to the states that you can choose that whether with this scheme you want to implement or not. Example being Border Area Development Program. Now, another thing that you need to understand is why these centrally sponsored schemes are important. Now, these centrally sponsored schemes are on subjects like health, skill development, etc. Now, such issues cut across the state boundaries. So, that is why the central government intervention in this regard is more or less required. And as has been highlighted by the 15th Finance Commission, that when you look at the expenditure responsibility of the state governments, it is around 62%. But when you look at the revenue raising capacity of the states, it is around 38%. So, in this regard also, the states needs the assistance from the center government in order to realize the idea of welfare state. Now, let's look into the issues which time and again the states have highlighted with regard to the implementation of centrally sponsored scheme. First issue being tied funds. Now, since the funds are tied, it does not give the leverage to the state government that they could, make requisite changes in the centrally sponsored schemes in accordance with the changing ground realities that are there. So, this is first issue. Another issue being, we have a lot of centrally sponsored schemes. Take the example of health itself. So, on health, we have a lot of schemes, National Health Mission, the ICDS scheme, Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana is there. Then we have also come up with an umbrella scheme, that is Pradhan Mantri Atmanirbhar Swasthya Bharat Yojana. Now, it has been highlighted that the number of umbrella scheme is around 35 in the financial year 2021-22. And let me tell you another fact. In one umbrella scheme, you have a lot of centrally sponsored schemes which are subsumed under that umbrella scheme. Now, this severely dents the federalism aspect of our Indian Constitution, because it takes away the freedom of the states to do localized planning. It takes away the freedom of the states when it comes to the formulation of the scheme and implementation of the scheme, keeping in mind the ground realities, okay, regional variations that are there. Then it adopts one-size-fits-all approach. So when it comes to the formulation of the scheme, the state governments are not consulted. So when it comes to centrally sponsored schemes, these are one-size-fits-all approach. On account of this, they witness issues when it comes to implementation of the centrally sponsored scheme. Likewise, the state of Telangana and Odisha has refused to implement the Pradhan Mantri Ayushman Bharat Yojana that is there. Then there are also issues with the allocations of these schemes. For example, it was highlighted in the budget 2020-21 that out of the 30 umbrella schemes that we have, 15 umbrella schemes are getting around 90% of the total allocation. What does this tell us? That rest of the schemes are not getting the due allocation. Now, when a scheme is not getting the due allocation, what is the point of going further with that scheme? This leads to inefficient use of public money that is there, or public expenditure. And Finance Commission has highlighted that in total, if you see, there are around 131 schemes. So, majority of the chunk of allocation is taken up by the 15 umbrella schemes. So, this is leading to inefficient public expenditure also. Then, there are also issues with regard to monitoring and evaluation of these schemes. Why? Because as I have told you, when it comes to the implementation of centrally sponsored schemes, it rests with the state governments. And another issue being that we have a plethora of centrally sponsored schemes. Now, this makes concurrent evaluation and monitoring of these schemes a very tedious task, which in turns, impacts the government ability to make mid-course requisite changes in the scheme in order to address the gaps in the implementation of these schemes. So, these are majorly the issues with regard to centrally sponsored scheme. Now, a subgroup of chief ministers was constituted by the Niti Aayog and it submitted its report on rationalization of centrally sponsored scheme in November 2015. Let's look into the recommendations which were given by this subgroup of chief ministers. Firstly, it recommended that the schemes need to be restructured. So, it pointed out that the number of schemes which are currently 66, they need to be reduced to maximum 30 centrally sponsored schemes should be there. And for every sector, there should be only one umbrella scheme that should be there. Okay. For every sector, we should not have more than one umbrella scheme. Then it also provided for classification of the schemes that we discussed in the initial, discussion itself. It provided that there would be the centrally sponsored schemes would be classified as core schemes, core of core schemes and optional schemes. So this classification was basically provided by this subgroup of chief ministers. Then with regard to allocation of fund, it pointed out that it would be the Ministry of Finance which would be providing scheme-wise allocation to the respective states when it comes to the implementation of core schemes. However, when it comes to the implementation of optional schemes, lump sum amount would be provided to the respective states. And it also pointed out that it is the responsibility of Niti Aayog to develop a criteria for allocation of funds to different states for core and optional scheme. And in this regard, Niti Aayog would be developing this criteria after consulting the state governments as well as the relevant state central ministries that are there. Okay. So in this regard, Niti Aayog has to consult both the state governments as well as the relevant central ministries that are there. Then with regard to fund sharing pattern, the subgroup recommended that when it comes to the fund sharing pattern with regard to core schemes, the funding pattern would not be changed. But when it comes to the fund sharing pattern with regard to core and optional scheme, this is what was recommended by this subgroup of chief ministers. And it also pointed out one more thing, that if for a particular centrally sponsored scheme, the central share is less than 50%, then that scheme should not be allowed. This is regarding the fund sharing pattern. Then when it comes to the release of fund, it recommended that although the allocation should be made based on the financial year, but the fund should be released on a quarterly basis. When it comes to the monitoring of centrally sponsored schemes, it recommended that a standing committee should be constituted, whose chairman would be the CEO of Niti Aayog, and it would also be having representatives from states, from UTs as well as from central government itself. So this standing committee would be looking into the monitoring of centrally sponsored schemes so that we could do mid-course corrections. Then with regard to flexi funds, the subgroup of chief ministers recommended that with regard to any centrally sponsored scheme, 25% of the central allocation for that particular scheme when it comes to states, and 30% of the central allocation for any scheme when it comes to union territories would be considered as flexi funds. What are flexi funds? So through these flexi funds, we are trying to give the requisite flexibility to the states so that they could, attune the centrally sponsored scheme with regard to the ground realities that are there. They can make the requisite changes in the centrally sponsored schemes when it comes to the implementation of those schemes. Then when it comes to the incomplete projects, the subgroup of chief ministers recommended that if a project began in 2014 and 15 and the funds for that particular project were given until 31st March 2015, and if it was found out that that particular project was not completed even after March 2017, then in this background, it would be the responsibility of the respective state government to complete that particular project by using its own fund. Okay. So all of the recommendations which were given by the subgroup of chief ministers was accepted by the central government. Apart from this, let's look into this aspect that what more needs to be done. Okay, apart from the recommendations which were given by subgroup of chief minister. Another thing that we need to do is we need to further rationalize the centrally sponsored scheme in order to realize the idea of federalism that is there. Because as I told you, when it comes to centrally sponsored schemes, they are basically on the subjects which are there in the state list. So further rationalization needs to be done, and the state and the center should cooperate with regard to only those schemes which are necessary. Okay, and let the state government come up with their own scheme on the subjects which are there in the state list. So further rationalization of the schemes are required. And when it comes to rationalization, on what grounds we can do the rationalization? We can do it on the basis of minimum threshold funding size for approval of centrally sponsored schemes. So in this regard, this was something which was recommended by 15th Finance Commission, that if a particular scheme is getting less than the threshold of annual expenditure for that particular scheme, then the threshold that we have decided, then that centrally sponsored scheme need to be done away with. Because there is no point of continuing such centrally sponsored scheme which are getting very low allocations. Okay, so in this regard, we need to come up with a threshold size. For example, B.K. Chaturvedi committee, which was constituted in 2011, it recommended that the threshold could be 100 crore. Keeping in mind the inflation, this threshold could be around 500 crores. So any centrally sponsored scheme which is getting less than this amount of allocation should be done away with, because continuing such centrally sponsored schemes which are getting less than this minimum threshold of funding, it leads to inadequate use of or inefficient use of public expenditure that is there. And it also makes it, monitoring of such schemes very tedious task. Then it was also pointed out by the 15th Finance Commission that we need to do zero-based budgeting of centrally sponsored schemes in order to take the decision that whether a particular centrally sponsored scheme should be carried forward or it should be removed. What is zero-based budgeting? So when it comes to zero-based budgeting, every time you are making allocation for a particular scheme in the budget, every time that allocation would be evaluated on this aspect, that is this allocation necessary and whether this allocation is efficient or not. Okay, zero based is because every time you're making an allocation in a budget, it would be evaluated that whether this allocation is necessary and efficient or not. We would not be allocating the money based on the past budgetary allocations which have been done. Okay, so the allocation would not be done based on the budget history that is there with regard to that particular scheme. Rather, the allocations would be done based on the performance of that very scheme. Every year when you are allocating a particular amount of money for that particular scheme, the government needs to evaluate that what is the performance of the scheme. Is this allocation really necessary and efficient or not? So this could be another ground based on which we can decide that whether a particular centrally sponsored scheme should continue or not. Then another reason that we have pointed out with regard to centrally sponsored scheme is the states government time and again have pointed out that they are not consulted when it comes to the formulation of the scheme. So in this regard, another suggestion could be the states should be consulted when it comes to the formulation of the scheme, and the states can also learn from the best practices of each other, and this would give further boost to the spirit of cooperative federalism. Okay, so we need to consult the states, so that because the implementation is ultimately resting with the states. So if you're not consulting the states, the implementation would automatically get impacted. So let's consult the state. The central government should consult the state in order to ensure effective formulation of the scheme and in order to ensure effective implementation of centrally sponsored schemes as well. Then when it comes to monitoring and evaluation, it has been recommended that the evaluation should be done by independent organizations which are not a part of the implementation process. Although we discussed right now that the subgroup of chief ministers recommended that a standing committee needs to be constituted in which the CEO of Niti Aayog would be the chairman, and it would be having representation from the state and the UTs as well and from the relevant central ministries. But the experts have pointed out that when it comes to the evaluation of centrally sponsored schemes, it should be done by such organizations, independent organizations, which are not a part of the implementation process. Another suggestion which has been given in this regard is we can go for social audit. What is social audit? Where the audit is done jointly by the government as well as by the people who are getting impacted by that very scheme. Okay, so through participation of the people in the auditing of that particular scheme, we could actually check on the ground that what is the efficiency of this very scheme. So through social audit, we would not only be doing financial auditing. Okay, financial auditing mainly checks that whether there is misappropriation of funds or not. But when it comes to social audit enables the government to examine the efficiency of a particular scheme at the ground level itself. So we can also go for social audit of the centrally sponsored scheme in order to improve the monitoring and evaluation of the schemes, which would in turn enable us to make mid-course correction, which would further enable us to address the gaps with regard to the formulation as well as implementation of the centrally sponsored schemes. Then lastly, we need to make further use of the platforms like Niti Aayog and Interstate Council, like we have done previously. The subgroup of chief ministers were basically constituted by Niti Aayog. So we need to make use of these platforms in order to realize the idea of cooperative federalism, because with the help of these platforms, the center and the state could coordinate with regard to formulation as well as implementation of centrally sponsored scheme, and these platforms enable the state government to raise their concerns, to raise their grievances with regard to formulation as well as implementation of centrally sponsored schemes. So such platform should be used further. That is all that we have to know with regard to this article. Let's move to the next one. Now this next article relates to changing rainfall patterns in India, and this article pertains to this aspect of your GS paper 1 syllabus. Let's try and look into the context. So the context is this year monsoon season has been very erratic. Why? Initial days of June we witnessed severe deficit, while during July we witnessed flooding in certain regions of India. It was followed by driest August since 1901, and September we record lot of rainfall. So this erratic rainfall is somewhere related to climate change. What is climate change? Climate change basically refers to long-term shifts in temperature as well as weather patterns. This definition has been given by United Nations itself. Let's look into the changing rainfall patterns that we are witnessing across India. According to Ministry of Earth Sciences, the regions which were previously witnessing low rainfall like Kutch, Saurashtra, Rajasthan, they are now receiving more rainfall. Example being, we witnessed floods in Barmar district of Rajasthan in 2006. On the other hand, the regions which used to previously receive high rainfall like Assam, Meghalaya, Bihar, Jharkhand, they are now getting less rainfall. Example, the Cherrapunji, which used to be the wettest area across the world, it is now receiving very low rainfall, below normal rainfall since 2001. And on account of this, Cherrapunji is also witnessing water stress situation. Then, according to IMD carried out a certain, analysis with regard to the changing rainfall pattern with regard to southwest monsoon during this period. And it found out that 5 states, that is UP, Bihar, West Bengal, Meghalaya and Nagaland, have shown significant decreasing trends in southwest monsoon rainfall during the recent 30 years period. Then what we have witnessed is the breaks in the monsoon have increased, resulting in larger dry periods in the monsoon itself. So on account of this, certain regions are witnessing drought situations on account of increased break. And we are also witnessing this thing that there is delay when it comes to the onset of monsoon itself. And another change in rainfall pattern, as was pointed out by Council on Energy, Environment and Water in its report titled Preparing India for Extreme Climate Events. It pointed out that certain regions are witnessing floods and drought simultaneously. Example, several districts in Bihar, UP, Odisha and Tamil Nadu are witnessing simultaneous droughts and floods. So this is the variation that we are witnessing with regard to rainfall patterns in India. The IMD, Ministry of Earth Sciences, everyone has pointed out that this is on account of climate change. Now, what are the concerns and impact of this variation in rainfall pattern that we are witnessing across India? First is water stress. This is something that we are witnessing in Cherrapunji in Meghalaya, as I have pointed out, that Cherrapunji, which used to be one of the wettest area across the world, it is now witnessing water stress on account of reduce in rainfall, the amount of rainfall that this region is receiving in Meghalaya. Then this year, Chhattisgarh, Bihar and Karnataka also witnessed water stress. Since Karnataka witnessed water stress, there was the issue of sharing of water of Kaveri river between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. Okay. Then it is also having impact on agriculture as well. In this regard, Niti Aayog, in one of its report titled Revitalizing Rain-Fed Agriculture in India 2017, pointed out that 52% of India's cropped area remains without irrigation. And this highlights that when it comes to India, we are majorly practicing rain-fed agriculture. So rainfall is very much needed for the agriculture sector. And again in this report, it was pointed out that 80% of the pulses, 73% of oilseeds and 68% of cotton come from rain-fed agriculture itself. So when it comes to the variation in rainfall pattern, it is going to severely impact the agriculture sector, because in India, agriculture is rain-fed. It is largely dependent on rains. Then it is going to have impact on food security as well. On account of fears of El Nino, that El Nino is going to have impact on the food grain production in India, the government went for partial ban on rice exports recently. And this was, on account of certain reason. First, the retail inflation in cereals was quite high during the June month of this year. And it was also in the background of this aspect that the amount of rice and wheat in the government godowns was quite low. Okay. So this highlights the fact that on account of variation in rainfall, we are going to witness food security challenges as well. Because on account of lack of rainfall or on account of erratic rainfall, the crop production is getting impacted. So this would have a severe impact on food security, because if the cereals or different, crops are less, then the food inflation is bound to increase. And if the food inflation is going to increase, then it would become a major challenge for the government to ensure that the poor section of our Indian society have access to cereals and different crops. Okay. Then experts have pointed out that on account of erratic rainfall, what we are witnessing is incidence of vector-borne diseases is bound to increase. Example, malaria and dengue. And lastly, on account of erratic rainfall, what we are witnessing is extreme weather events. What are extreme weather events? According to Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, extreme weather events are such events which are rare in a particular region and at a particular time. So what we are witnessing this year only is we are witnessing heavy rainfall in Chandigarh, Haryana and Himachal Pradesh, which has resulted in floods and landslides. And we have also witnessed cloudburst in Himachal Pradesh. Whereas at the other side, we are witnessing drought-like conditions in Maharashtra. So on account of variation in rainfall, we are witnessing these concerns and these impacts. Now in this regard, what needs to be done in order to make sure that we are effectively able to address these concerns and impact? So India need to, hasten its transition towards renewable energy, and we need to realize the idea of net carbon zero emissions. Then in order to address the water stress situation, we need to focus upon water conservation through rainwater harvesting, and we also need to focus upon reuse of wastewater like grey water management. Then in order to address the impact on agriculture, we should incentivize such crops which are suitable for a particular agroclimatic zone, which are able to withstand the extreme weather events which are there. Then we also need to invest in resilient infrastructure which can withstand the extreme weather events. Okay, so in this regard, public-private partnership is very much needed because the government is not able to provide the requisite fund in order to develop resilient infrastructure, climate resilient infrastructure. Okay. And lastly, we need to invest on early warning systems as well, so that we are in a position to predict the variations in rainfall, and we could prepare ourselves with regard to extreme weather events in order to minimize the crop loss, in order to minimize the livelihood loss, and in order to minimize the loss of infrastructure. So these all actions the government needs to take, and in this regard, we also need the cooperation of the citizens. That is all that we have to note down with regard to this particular topic. Let's move to the next one. Now the next topic relates to the issues with regard to functioning of government hospital, and this topic pertains to this aspect of your GS paper 2 syllabus. Let's try and understand the context. So the context is Bombay High Court takes suo motu cognizance of 35 deaths, which also included infants, that took place in a government run hospital in Nanded district of Maharashtra. Now in this regard, the first thing that we need to understand is what is suo motu cognizance. Suo motu cognizance basically implies that the court is taking action on its own. Okay, there has not been any request from the concerned parties, no petition has been filed with regard to that particular issue. The court is taking action on its own notice. That is what suo motu cognizance implies. Now let's look into the issues which we are witnessing with regard to the functioning of government hospitals. The first thing that we need to understand is, when you look at India, very less number of people are dependent on public hospitals. This was pointed out by NSS survey on health, which was conducted in 2017 and 18, which pointed out that less than 1/3 of the population of India is dependent on public hospital. Majority is dependent upon the private hospital, even though the private hospital charge exorbitant prices. And when it comes to public hospitals, only 36% of our bottom quintile population is dependent on public hospitals to get healthcare services. When it comes to government hospital, we are witnessing regional variations. When it comes to Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, Bihar and Haryana, only 1/5 of the population is dependent upon public hospitals. Whereas when you look at the contribution of public hospitals or government hospitals in the state of Odisha, Tamil Nadu and Kerala, it is quite high. So there the government hospitals are performing very good. This is on account of the factor that when it comes to health, it falls in the state list. So there are regional variations when it comes to the performance or the functioning of government hospitals. Wherever the states government has the requisite political will, they have bring in the requisite reforms in the government hospitals, and in other states where the political will was lacking, we are witnessing that the sorry state of affair when it comes to the government hospital is still continuing. Example being UP, Punjab, Bihar, etc. Then another issue is poor doctor to population ratio. In India, we have only one government allopathic doctor for every 10,189 people. It is quite high what the WHO has recommended in that regard. WHO has recommended that there should be one doctor per 1,000 population. But if you look at the government hospitals, the burden on a particular government allopathic doctor is quite high because he has to provide the services to around 10,000 people. Then when it comes to the allopathic doctors, okay, modern allopathic doctors, only 10% of them are ready to work in public healthcare sector. This was something which was pointed out by the National Health Profile 2017. And what happens, what is the consequence of poor doctor to population ratio, especially in the rural areas? The consequence is people start relying on the quacks who do not have the requisite degree to practice medicine. This was also pointed out by WHO in its 2016 report that merely 1 in 5 doctors which are found in the rural areas have the requisite qualification to practice medicine. And what we have witnessed on account of lack of doctors in the rural areas is 75% of primary care visits are basically done to quacks. Okay, so people largely go to the quacks to get the requisite health facilities in the rural area especially. Then when you look at the infrastructure, we have poor infrastructure in the government hospitals. So you only have one government hospital bed for every 2,046 people. And on account of poor infrastructure, what happens is the government hospitals do not get the requisite funds so that they could be equipped with the modern technologies that are there. Okay. And on account of this, what happens is we witness such incidents of infant deaths that we witness in Gorakhpur's Baba Raghav Das Medical College. This is majorly on account of poor infrastructure, being the lack of modern health technologies which are very much needed in the government hospital. This is one of the major reasons that when it comes to the secondary care, when it comes to tertiary health care, people prefer to rely on the private hospitals even though they charge exorbitant rates, because the government hospital do not have the requisite modern health facilities which are needed. Then another issue that we are witnessing is lack of primary healthcare services. Now, when it comes to private sector, it is focusing more on secondary healthcare and tertiary healthcare. When it comes to Government of India, it is focusing on primary healthcare, but the attention or the allocation which the Government of India is making to the primary healthcare is still low. Because since when it comes to secondary and tertiary healthcare, we have private sector there. Government should focus more on the primary healthcare so that we could prevent certain diseases. Okay, because the primary healthcare plays a very prominent role in preventive healthcare. Then there are other issues as well. For example, the standing time is quite high when it comes to the government hospitals. They are not closely situated to the the patient's home, and unresponsive attitude of the doctors or the healthcare workers which are working in government hospital is also one of the major concerns, on account of which people are very much less dependent when it comes to the public hospital. Whereas when it comes to the private hospital, they get due attention and care from the healthcare professionals that are working in the private sector. Now, in this regard, we need to understand that what needs to be done. First and foremost, we need to address the shortage of healthcare professionals. especially in the rural areas. So in this regard, another fact we need to make note of, National Medical Commission, it conducted, survey of 246 medical colleges, and what it found out, that these 246 medical colleges do not have the requisite faculty and senior doctors. Now tell me, when a particular medical college is not having the requisite faculties and the senior doctors, who is going to train our doctors? And as we know, the population is increasing. We need great supply of healthcare professionals. So in this regard, the government need to make sure that although the government is, setting up aims like colleges time and again, but it also needs to make sure that all the medical colleges have requisite faculties and senior doctors who are there to train our future doctors. And it also need to make sure that when it comes to the medical colleges should be provided with the requisite infrastructure that they need and the requisite technologies that they need in order to acquaint our future doctors with the modern technologies. And another way of addressing the shortage of healthcare professionals is we can also train the quacks which are in the rural areas, and we can take the help of these quacks. We can provide, a formal training to them, and we can take the help of the quacks when it comes to preventive healthcare. We are not saying that when it comes to training the quacks, you should allow the quacks to, enable them to give injections for a particular disease. That is not the experts are suggesting. When it comes to quacks, the experts have only pointed out that we should provide them some sort of formal training so that we can take their help when it comes to preventive healthcare in the rural areas especially. And another thing, we need to address the shortage of doctors in the rural areas. In this regard, the government needs to take requisite steps. It should incentivize the youth that they go and give their services in the rural areas. This could be done with regard to government, health professionals that are there. Initially, they should be sent to the rural areas. Over a period of time, as and when they perform better, they could be shifted to the urban areas. Because we need to address the healthcare professionals shortage, especially with regard to rural areas. Then we need to ensure equity and excellence in public healthcare, especially with regard to rural areas. So government need to take, requisite step. It need to make requisite allocation so that requisite infrastructure, bed infrastructure, modern medical facilities could be provided in the rural areas as well. And till the time we can make use of telemedicine. And this telemedicine we can also use to, in the short term to address the shortage of healthcare professionals, especially in the rural areas. Then government needs to increase the government spending when it comes to the healthcare sector, which is still hovering around 1% of the GDP. It needs to be increased to 2.5% of the GDP. Because if you look at the OECD countries, they are allocating around 7% of, government spending to the healthcare sector. In this regard, the government of India also needs to enhance its spending when it comes to the healthcare sector. Then, as we have discussed right now, the government should focus on primary healthcare so that we could make great advances in the preventive healthcare sector that is there. And lastly, the government should come forward to provide health insurance for the missing middle. Okay. This was pointed out by Niti Aayog in its health insurance for India's missing middle, wherein the Niti Aayog pointed out that when it comes to the people who are earning quite high, they get insurance from private healthcare sector. And when it comes to the people who are in the bottom quintile, they are getting healthcare insurance through Ayushman Bharat Yojana. But when it comes to the missing middle, the people who lie somewhere between these, poor sections and the people who are earning quite high, they lack any sort of health insurance. So in this regard, the government should come forward and, it could go for PPP model for providing health insurance to these middle income group also, to provide the requisite health insurance facilities to middle income groups as well. That is all that we have to make note of from this very topic. Let's move to the next one. Now this next topic relates to Nobel Prize in the field of chemistry, and this topic relates to this aspect of your prelim syllabus. Let's try and understand the context. So the context is, this year's Nobel Prize in Chemistry is awarded to Moingi Bawendi, Lois E. Bruce and Alexei E. Emikov for discovery of quantum dots, which are now used in LEDs. Now the first thing that we need to make note of with regard to this very article is, what are quantum dots? So before we understand quantum dots, first understand this thing. When it comes to any element, its property depends on the number of electrons it is having. Okay. When it comes to quantum dots, they are nano-sized in all dimensions. So since they are nano-sized, a lot of electrons are squeezed in a very small space. Now, on account of this, when it comes to quantum dots, its behavior depends on the size. And when it comes to quantum dots, the interesting feature with regard to quantum dots is their interaction with light. So since a lot of electrons are squeezed in a very small space, what happens? They absorb energy and they emit light of different colors. On account of this, when it comes to quantum dots, it has become an interesting field of study. Now, another aspect that we need to understand is, what is the application of quantum dots? So quantum dots, on account of their ability to absorb energy and emit light of different colors, they are being used in LEDs, lamps, in televisions, in computers, and they are also enabling the doctors and the surgeons to remove the tumor tissues. They are also used in solar panels, and they can also be used as biosensors. So they can be used to identify the pathogens in contaminated food and water and to, find out the pollutants in the environment. So it has multiple uses. Now, why these three have been provided the Nobel Prize in Chemistry? In 1980s itself, the chemistry laureates Lois Bruce and Alexei Emikov succeeded in creating independently of each other quantum dots, which are nanoparticles, as we discussed right now, so tiny that quantum effects determine their characteristics. As we have discussed right now, when it comes to quantum dots, their size determines their behavior. And in 1993, Moingi Bawendi revolutionized the method for manufacturing quantum dots, making their quality extremely high, a vital prerequisite for their use in today's nanotechnology. This is the reason that these three have been provided with Nobel Prize in Chemistry. That is all that we have to make note of from this very topic. Let's move to the last topic. Now, this last topic pertains to glacial lake outburst floods. And this topic pertains to this aspect of your prelim syllabus. Let's try and understand the context. So, recently we have witnessed glacial lake outburst floods in Sikkim. Now, the first thing that you need to understand with regard to this article is, what are glacial lakes? So these are large water bodies which are either placed in front of or on top of or beneath a melting glacier, and they are dammed by unstable ice and sediments like loose rock and debris. So as and when their size grow, they become quite dangerous. Why? Because whenever their wall is breached, it leads to sudden flow of water from the mountains, which leads to glacial lake outburst floods, what we have witnessed currently in Sikkim. Now, how does this happen? This could happen on account of different reasons. There could be an earthquake, there could be avalanches, okay, on account of heavy rainfall in a particular region. When it comes to Sikkim, the major cause of glacial lake outburst was this South Lonak Lake in Sikkim. And the cause for this is anticipated that earthquake which was recently witnessed in Nepal. The experts have pointed out that this could be one of the causes of glacial lake outburst flood that we have recently witnessed in Sikkim. And previously in 2013, we have witnessed glacial lake outburst in Uttarakhand region as well, which led to deaths of several people. And it was on account of this Chorabari Tal Glacial Lake. Now, what are the main features of this glacial lake outburst floods? They are sudden, okay? They lead to sudden release of water. These are rapid events which last for hours or few days only, and it leads to huge downstream flow of water from the mountains. When it comes to threat to India, it has been found out that in the Himalayas, there are around 25 glacial lakes and water bodies which are witnessing an increase in the water spread since 2019. So, on account of this, there is, the vulnerability of all the Himalayan states when it comes to the glacial lake outburst floods. So, all the Himalayan states are basically vulnerable to this glacial lake outburst flood. And in the Sikkim Himalayas itself, it has been pointed out that number of glacial lakes are more than 300. So, this highlights that different regions of India are vulnerable to glacial lake outburst floods events. Now, in this regard, what needs to be done? We need to follow the NDMA guidelines. What are the NDMA guidelines in this regard? NDMA has pointed out that we need to identify the areas which are prone to these glacial lake outburst floods. Okay, so we need to find out the vulnerable areas. Then we need to restrict the infrastructure activities in such vulnerable areas. Then it also pointed out that we need to make use of modern technology like synthetic aperture radar imaging, which could be used to monitor the changes in the water bodies, these glacial lakes which are there. Because as we discussed, as and when these glacial lakes which are dammed by unstable ice and sediments, as and when they grow larger, they become more and more dangerous. So, in this background, NDMA has pointed out that we need to monitor the changes in these glacial lakes in order to avoid this glacial lake outburst floods. Then, NDMA has also pointed out that we need to train the local people, because in majority of the cases, in around 80% of the cases, what we have found out that whenever this glacial lake outburst flood event happens, it is the local people who perform the rescue operations. Okay, and in this regard, it has also pointed out that we need to train the local people so that we could get the participation of local people when it comes to monitoring the requisite changes in the glacial lakes, okay, which are beneath the melting glaciers. So, we need to effectively implement these NDMA guidelines in order to prevent the harm that we witness on account of glacial lake outburst floods. That is all that we have to make note of from today's analyst. Thank you for listening to this very discussion, and all the very best for your preparation.